At 69 years old, Marjorie Latham had already learned that rain could soak through a dress, cold could numb your hands, and loneliness could hurt more than either. But she had never imagined that her own son could leave her standing outside his front door for 3 hours while he sat inside eating dinner with his wife and their guests. She hadn't arrived uninvited. She hadn't come empty-handed. She had been invited. In her trembling hands were a transformer toy her grandson Alden had begged her for, a box of expensive macarons for Clarissa, and a lifetime of hope that maybe, after everything she had done for her family, she finally had a place at their table. Instead, Clarissa had looked her straight in the eyes and told her to wait outside. Then Barrett, the little boy Marjorie had raised, sacrificed for, and financially supported for decades, opened the door and said something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Mom, you're going to have to leave." Marjorie looked through the window. She could see the dining room glowing beneath a chandelier. She could hear laughter. She could smell the roast dinner she had helped make possible. And then she heard her grandson ask, "Daddy, who is that?" Barrett paused. Then came the sentence that shattered something inside her. "No one important." Marjorie stood there in the rain, staring at the son she had spent her entire life protecting. But what Barrett and Clarissa didn't know was that the woman they had just humiliated wasn't as powerless as they believed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the house they were celebrating in, the accounts paying their bills, and even the lifestyle they had become accustomed to, were connected to one person they had just pushed too far. Marjorie reached into her purse. Her fingers closed around her phone, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't calling to save her son. She was calling to save herself. To understand how a mother could end up standing in the rain outside her own son's home, you have to go back 31 years, to a small apartment above a laundromat in Dayton, Ohio, where a young widow named Marjorie Latham worked double shifts as a hospital records clerk to keep a roof over her boy's head. Her husband, Walter, had died in a construction accident when Barrett was only 4, leaving her with a mortgage she couldn't afford and a grief she never had time to properly feel. She sold her wedding ring within the first year. She sold her mother's china within the second. Every sacrifice she made quietly, because she believed a mother's love was supposed to be invisible, felt only in its results, never in its cost. Barrett grew up believing his mother simply managed. He never saw the second job she took cleaning offices at midnight. He never knew she skipped meals so he could have new shoes before the school year started. When he was accepted into a state university with partial scholarships, Marjorie took out a loan against the only asset she had left, a small life insurance policy from Walter's death, and covered the rest without telling him how. She wanted him to walk into that world unburdened, believing that opportunity had simply found him. It was the kind of love that asked for nothing in return, and for a long time, that was exactly what it received. Barrett met Clarissa during his final year of business school. She came from a family with old money and older opinions about who belonged where. Marjorie remembered the first time she met her, at a restaurant far too expensive for her taste, and how Clarissa's eyes moved over her second-hand coat, the way someone might inspect a stain on a tablecloth. Marjorie said nothing. She smiled. She complimented the girl's earrings, and she paid for her own meal before anyone could offer, because she had learned long ago that dignity was often the only currency she had left, and she intended to keep spending it wisely. The wedding came 2 years later, paid for in part by a check Marjorie wrote from savings she had been building since Barrett was in diapers. Clarissa's parents contributed the venue. Marjorie contributed nearly everything else, quietly, the way she always had. Nobody toasted her that night. Nobody mentioned her name in the speeches. She sat near the back, in a dress she had altered herself, and watched her son begin a new chapter of his life, believing, foolishly perhaps, that her place in it was secure simply because she had built the foundation it stood on. For the first few years, Marjorie remained close to the family. She babysat when Alden was born. She drove 2 hours every other weekend just to rock him to sleep, so Barrett and Clarissa could rest. She never asked for gas money. She never asked for thanks. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the invitations grew fewer, the phone calls shortened. Clarissa began referring to her, in front of others, as Barrett's mother rather than family, a small linguistic distance that widened every year until Marjorie found herself hearing about birthdays after they had already happened, learning of vacations from photographs posted online rather than conversations shared beforehand. What made the distance harder to bear was the money, not because Marjorie resented giving it, but because it never seemed to buy her anything beyond a Christmas card and a photo at Thanksgiving if she was lucky. When Barrett's startup nearly collapsed in its second year, it was Marjorie who quietly transferred funds from an account few people knew existed, an account tied to her late husband's brother, a reclusive man named Elliot Pierce, who had made a considerable fortune in commercial real estate decades earlier and had never had children of his own. Elliot trusted Marjorie completely, had named her the sole trustee of a fund meant to protect the family's future, and had asked only one thing of her in return, that she use it wisely and never let anyone abuse it. Barrett never knew the money that saved his company came from that trust. He believed, because Marjorie let him believe it, that a business loan from a private investor had come through at the right moment. She never told him the truth, because she never wanted her generosity treated like a transaction, something owed rather than given freely. But somewhere along the way, without her noticing, that generosity stopped being seen as generosity at all. It became expected. It became invisible in exactly the way she had once mistaken for love, except this time it was Barrett who had learned to take without seeing the cost, rather than a mother who had learned to give without counting one. The house Barrett and Clarissa lived in, the one glowing with chandelier light while Marjorie stood outside in the rain, had been purchased 2 years earlier with a down payment that came, once again, from the Pierce Family Trust. Marjorie had signed the transfer herself, believing she was helping her son build a stable home for her grandson. She had asked for nothing except one guarantee, written quietly into the trust's terms at her own insistence, that she would always have a place in that home, a right that existed not out of sentiment, but because she had learned, after a lifetime of being taken for granted, to protect herself, even while protecting others. That night in the rain, none of that history was visible to Barrett or Clarissa. All they saw was an aging woman in a damp coat, holding a toy and a box of pastries, standing outside a party she was never truly meant to attend. Clarissa had decided, weeks earlier, that Marjorie's presence embarrassed her in front of guests from her social circle, people who asked pointed questions about family background and expected impressive answers. Barrett, wanting peace in his marriage more than he wanted honesty with his mother, had agreed to a plan that reduced Marjorie's invitation to a formality, one he intended to quietly walk back the moment she arrived. When Alden asked who the woman outside was, Barrett had a choice. He could have told the truth, that she was his mother, the grandmother who had rocked him to sleep and driven 2 hours every weekend just to see his face. Instead, he chose comfort, chose the path that required no explanation to his wife's friends, and in doing so, he said the 4 words that would end up costing him everything he believed was permanently his: no one important. Marjorie heard it clearly through the glass, and something in her, something patient and long-suffering, finally reached its limit. She did not cry outside that door. She did not knock again. She turned, walked back to her car through the rain, and sat behind the wheel for nearly 20 minutes without moving, replaying 3 decades of sacrifice against 4 seconds of dismissal. Then she opened her purse, found her phone, and called a number she had not dialed in over a year, the private line belonging to the attorney who managed the Pierce Family Trust on her behalf. When he answered, she did not raise her voice. She simply said, calmly, "I need you to begin the process we discussed. Tonight." The attorney, a careful man named Franklin Osei, who had handled Elliot Pierce's affairs for over 2 decades, had drafted contingency documents years earlier at Marjorie's request, documents she had hoped she would never need to use. They outlined a clean, legal, and immediate withdrawal of trust support from any beneficiary who failed to honor the basic conditions of respect and inclusion that Elliot Pierce himself had insisted upon before his death. Conditions Marjorie had quietly built into every dollar she had ever passed along to her son. Franklin listened to her voice, steady despite what she had clearly just endured, and told her the paperwork could be finalized within the week. The next morning, Barrett woke to a call from his bank, informing him that a scheduled transfer covering the mortgage had been cancelled by the account holder. He assumed it was an error. By that afternoon, his business account, the one still quietly subsidized by trust distributions he had never fully understood, showed a formal notice of termination, effective immediately. Confused and increasingly alarmed, he called his mother. She did not answer. He called again. Still nothing. It was the first time in his adult life that Marjorie Latham had ever let her phone ring without picking it up for her son, and the silence on the other end told him more than any conversation could have. Clarissa, realizing the scale of what was unfolding, insisted Barrett drive to his mother's apartment immediately. When he arrived, he found her sitting calmly at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, dressed as though the previous night had never happened. She let him in without hesitation, because despite everything, she was not a woman interested in cruelty for its own sake. She simply told him the truth. She told him about Elliot Pierce, about the trust, about every payment he had never known was hers to give and hers to take away. She told him, quietly, that respect was not a bonus feature of love, but its foundation, and that a man who could stand in a doorway and call his mother no one important had already answered the only question that mattered. Barrett tried to argue that it had been a moment of poor judgment, a single sentence spoken under social pressure, not a reflection of how he truly felt. Marjorie listened patiently, the way she always had, and then asked him a question he could not answer honestly. She asked him how many other moments, smaller and less visible, had led to that one, the unpaid attention, the forgotten calls, the years of treating her generosity as a given rather than a gift. Barrett had no response, because deep down, he already knew the truth she was pointing to, and no amount of apology could undo the pattern that had built up quietly over more than a decade. In the weeks that followed, Barrett and Clarissa's life changed with a speed that stunned everyone around them. The house went up for sale within a month. The business Barrett had built on borrowed foundations struggled without its silent support, and the social circle Clarissa had worked so hard to impress grew noticeably quieter once the family's financial reality became apparent. None of it happened out of malice on Marjorie's part. She simply stopped rescuing people who had never learned to value what rescue actually cost. For the first time in his adult life, Barrett had to build something entirely on his own, without a safety net he never even knew existed until it was gone. Marjorie, meanwhile, did not disappear into bitterness. She used a portion of the trust, with Franklin's guidance, to fund a modest but meaningful project of her own, a community support fund for widowed mothers in Dayton, women living the same invisible sacrifices she once had. She began attending fundraisers, not as anyone's mother, but as herself, a woman finally recognized for exactly who she was, rather than what she quietly provided. She kept a small, framed photograph of Alden on her kitchen table, not out of anger toward the boy who had asked an innocent question, but because he remained the one person in that house untouched by the choices the adults around him had made. Nearly a year after that rainy night, Barrett showed up at Marjorie's door alone, without Clarissa, holding nothing but a folded piece of paper. It was a letter he had written and rewritten more times than he could count, an honest account of everything he had failed to see in the years he treated his mother's love as background noise rather than the foundation of his entire life. He did not ask for money. He did not ask to be forgiven immediately. He simply asked if she would read it, and if, in time, there might be room for him to earn back what he had so carelessly discarded in 4 careless words spoken through a closed door. Marjorie read the letter slowly, standing in the same doorway where she had once been kept waiting in the rain. She did not answer him that day. She told him only that respect, once broken, could not be rebuilt with a single letter or a single apology, but with time, consistency, and the kind of quiet effort she herself had given for 30 years without ever once being asked to prove it. She closed the door gently, not out of cruelty, but because for the first time in her life, Marjorie Latham understood that love without boundaries was not sacrifice, it was simply erasure, and she had spent enough of her life disappearing for people who never once thought to ask where she had gone.